He divides, you'll note in verse 1 and 2, divides the whole history of the world. He divides the whole history of eternity into two halves. And you see there's the division there. He says that in former times, God spoke through prophets. And now he has spoken through his Son. Just two divisions. And there's not a third time. He says there's not going to come a time when Jesus is superseded by something better, because the point is that there's nothing better. He's not going to say that something perfect will come, because the point of this book is that you can't get better than perfect. And so Jesus is that ultimate, final, conclusive revelation of who God is. But let's consider the old ways. Verse 1. It says that in the previous era, God was at work making himself known to his people. We see even in the very first verses of the Bible, Genesis 1, it talks about how God is a speaking God, that he speaks and communicates, and that he makes humanity and then begins communicating to humanity, telling what they're made for, how they relate to him. And then, of course, humanity sins, Adam, Eve sin, and then chapter 2, was it 3? I think the end of chapter 2. It says that they sin, and then they hide themselves from God. And then so God speaks to them. He communicates. He speaks to them to seek them out. And he's been continuing to speak and to communicate to sinful people who are avoiding him, who are fleeing from him, who have sinned and want nothing to do with him. God, ever since Genesis chapter 3, is speaking and communicating to people. It says that he revealed himself not occasionally, not every once in a while, but it says he revealed himself at many times. And not uniformly, but it says in many ways. And so when we think of God revealing himself through the prophets, of course we think of perhaps the Old Testament prophets like Elijah and Daniel and Ezekiel. It's a very good thing for us to think of those prophets. But we should not only think of them. What prophets mean here just means the whole Old Testament writers. That the ones who penned down the Old Testament for us are considered that's how God has spoken to his people through the Word. And they reveal who God is. They reveal what God is like. They declare what God is like. And so when we think of the prophet Micah, the book of Micah, and it just emphasizes how much God cares about justice. When we think of Exodus, and we think of the exciting story of redemption, when we read of the heartbreaking story of faithfulness and betrayal in the book of Hosea, when we think of the repeating of the law in Deuteronomy, when we think of the love and devotion and passion that we see in the Song of Solomon, when we think of the redemptive care of Ruth, when we think of the holiness of Leviticus, when we think of the poetry of the Psalms, when we think of the power and glory of Daniel, all of these and more speak to us of who God is. They point us towards the character of God. And his revelation is so big and so vast that it doesn't all fit in one biblical book. That there's not one prophet, one speaker, one author that can fit who he is. And so, in many ways and at many times, God spoke to us through the prophets. We need them all to see the full Old Testament picture. We see him in the Old Testament commands, the Old Testament exhortation. We see him in the stories, in the dreams, in the mighty acts of redemption, in the still small voice, in the burning bush. We see these are some of the ways that we see the diverse and multifaceted nature of God. And you know, I love the Old Testament. I love it. I look forward to Wednesday nights. It's Old Testament night. Yes! And just think thinking of the diverse ways that God has spoken. And even just thinking, again, by means of illustration, just of a painter that's trying to just portray something, you know? And so the painter would just use as many different brushes as she's able, using as many different kinds of strokes, as many different colors and textures to get across the portrait or the subject that's trying to be painted. And I just think that the Old Testament is a wonderful, wonderful portrayal of who God is. But you know what? It's insufficient. It's so great, but it's not great enough. All the prophetic writings, all the mighty acts of redemption, all the care and love that we see in the Old Testament, it's not enough to truly and fully and completely reveal God to us. Does that blow your mind? Have you even read the Old Testament? It's big. And that's not enough. It's great, and it's not great enough. Hebrews 1:1 says, long ago, God revealed himself through the prophets, but now in a better way, he has revealed himself through Jesus Christ. There's the expansive, but yet incomplete work of revelation in the 40 books of the Old Testament. But Jesus has now come, and all those writers, all those prophets and priests and kings, they came at different locations and different times, but now Jesus has come, and he came once. And he is the complete revelation of who God is. It's wonderful to think about that. And we will see that the author of Hebrews reminds us of the words of Jesus as revelatory of God. But we should not only think of Jesus' words. Some of us might have a red letter Bible where the words of Jesus are in red. But you know, it's not just Jesus' words that reveal God. It is his whole life. His entire life, his entire ministry is one of revealing God. Allow me to read a quote from David Guzik. He says, the revelation from Jesus himself was unique because not only was it purely God's message, as that was the case with every other inspired writer, but it also was God's personality through the message came. The personality of Paul, Peter, John, and the other biblical writers is clear in their writings. Yet in the revelation that is from Jesus, we see the personality of God. We think of Jesus as being the personality of God. Does that blow your mind?